The BC NDP are going to intervene on behalf of the federal government and against Saskatchewan and Ontario in their fight to stop the imposition of a federal carbon tax on their citizens against their will. You know, the NDP, they really are the same clueless bunch all over. And today I'll show you how the NDP accidentally agree with those of us who oppose the carbon tax, but they might just be a little too carbon tax crazy to realize it. British Columbia's NDP government is intervening on behalf of Justin Trudeau and Environment Minister Catherine McKenna in separate court cases, one in Saskatchewan and another in Ontario, where those respective provinces are challenging the federal government's authority to impose a carbon tax on them. BC Attorney General David Eby told Global News, the significance of British Columbia's appearing in support of many aspects of the federal government's argument is we may be the only province standing in support of what the federal government is doing, and we think the court should hear a provincial perspective in support of the federal government. And then Eby probably should have just stopped talking right then, but he didn't. Here's what Eby said next. If BC is the only province with a price on carbon, or one of the only provinces, then British Columbians are working on a playing field that is not even. Hang on for a second here. You mean to tell me places with a carbon tax are at a competitive disadvantage when compared to those places with no carbon tax? Thanks for coming around to my way of thinking, David Eby. This is why Canada cannot have a carbon tax, especially when we are right next door to the United States, a massive place with no carbon tax. So yeah, I completely agree with David Eby. BCers are at a competitive disadvantage because of their carbon tax. But instead of forcing the rest of the country to have an ineffective tax on the air, why doesn't BC just get rid of their carbon tax and level the playing field for themselves instead of just dragging everybody else down to the bottom with them? And when I call the BC carbon tax ineffective, I'm not even close to joking. Despite their carbon tax and their persistent kissing up to the federal government by agreeing to bring in a $50 a ton carbon tax by 2022, the BC government is going to miss their legislative target of reducing emissions by 33% by 2020. Actually, from 2014 to 2015, carbon emissions increased by 1.6% in British Columbia. The BC carbon tax has been so ineffective that in Washington state, of all places, anti-carbon tax crusaders there routinely point to BC as an example of why they don't need a carbon tax and why a carbon tax wouldn't work to achieve its stated goals. And repeatedly pointing to BC turns out to be a pretty darn effective strategy, because for the third time, Washington state voters have rejected a carbon tax. BC's carbon tax scheme is so bad, the hyper-lefties in Washington state, the home of Seattle and Starbucks, don't want it. And yet the BC NDP have the audacity to think the rest of Canada deserves it. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. Speaking of carbon taxes, I'm going to the place where these bad ideas are born, at UN climate change conferences. There's one coming up in Poland, and the Canadian government has asked the United Nations to ban me, but I'm going anyway. If you can help support our independent journalism there and pitch in to cover the cost of my trip to Poland, go to rebelun.com.